Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really delighted to welcome you to this panel today on transforming the North into a global gateway. Joined by a fantastic panel, and I think it could be a fairly substantial debate. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Ford. I'm Head of Strategy, Policy and Research at Transport for the North. My role is responsible for our strategic transport plan and its delivery, our freight and logistics strategy, and our research programme, including the transport-related social exclusion work that some of you will have heard about earlier, and our Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review. So really exciting remit. I've been at TfN for 6 months now, and it's fantastic to see so many partners and stakeholders here today, and I'm looking forward to meeting many of you throughout the rest of the day. Before I invite our panel to give a few introductory remarks and let you know who they are, just a reminder for anyone who is using social media today to use the Transforming the North hashtag. So why should we be focusing on the North growing its role as a global gateway? The freight and logistics sector is critical to the North's economy now and in the future. Our data shows us that by 2050, it could be worth more than £30 billion and employ more than 500,000 people. More than 33% of goods enter through northern ports and airports. 25% of Great British freight starts in the north, and 25% of freight journeys end in the north. We've got 11 major ports, including a number of free ports. We've got 7 international airports, a considerable road and rail network, and a number of intermodal terminals, including 3 strategic rail freight interchanges across the region. The sector is a huge opportunity. And yet, so often, we only hear about the sector from our residents when things go wrong. When you can't get your fruit and veg in shops, or when your next day delivery doesn't arrive at your door when you've ordered it. We need to work collaboratively to address the issues that the sector faces, particularly in terms of improving capacity and connectivity, journey reliability, supporting less polluting movements of goods, and supporting modal shift. At TfN, freight is integral to our work. We have been leading the way in making the case for freight as a subnational transport body. Work is now stepping up at pace. In recent months, we've made freight integral to our work streams and roles across TfN so that we consider passenger and freight needs in our work. There's lots of important issues for us today with our panel, so I'm going to ask each of our panel members if they could introduce themselves and why you think the North is important as a global gateway. Chris, if I could start with you.
Hi, my name is Chris Woodroofe. I am the Managing Director of Manchester Airport, which is worth £5.7 billion of GVA just for the North. We have a catchment of 22 million passengers that go all the way up to Scotland, down to Wales and across to Hull. And it's interesting to look at how that GVA gets distributed. So here in Liverpool, over £100 million worth of GVA. Over in Leeds, over £100 million of GVA. But you go out to Hull, it's down to more like 10 million. And I think our view is that the transport links between these large metropolitan cities really impact the ability of the airport to drive economic growth in those locations. We're doing a big piece of investment, driving better experiences for our passengers, investing well over £1 billion, and that will be finished in the summer of 25. But if I think about freight more specifically, then cargo, from our perspective, is very much about what goes in the bellies of aircraft that are flying to all these different long-haul destinations. And Arup have done a piece of work using the TfN background data to say, what could Manchester Airport do by 2050 if the economics and the policies all worked in our favour? And the answer is you could turn that 5.7 billion GVA into 16 billion. We could add another 50 long-haul routes and connect direct Manchester to all these different destinations, all of whom would be seeking to bring cargo into the airport in the bellies of those aircraft. So I think all in, from my perspective, you have a panel called Global. It would be odd not to invite an airport to come along and talk about it. But that integrated transport network is so important, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about some of the work that we could do to make it better. Our team were together with Hugh Merriman this morning, talking about that, the future of the north-west-east connections and how much better they could be, and that would work both for passengers and for freight, no doubt.
Thank you. If you could just hand over to Councillor Handley.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anne Handley, and I'm the leader of East Riding of Yorkshire Council. I've been in the post since May last year, and I'm really pleased that Chris has just mentioned that there's only £10 million GVA going over to the East Riding. And that's quite simply because there is no trains to Manchester from the East Riding. We really, really struggle. We can't even get a train to Leeds from the East Riding of Yorkshire. So if you were to look on a map, we go from Liverpool to Manchester to Leeds and then up to Newcastle. We are completely out in the cold. So I'm here today for a couple of reasons, really. Certainly from a passenger point of view, but from a trade point of view and a freight point of view, I have just got a couple of stats I'd like to share with you. So the Humber ports handle £80 billion worth of trade, generating 6.6 of value added, and we employ over 90,000 people in that area. That is enormous, and we need a place at the table, and that's why I'm here, because I want to sit here and say, we are there, we are open for business, but the rail infrastructure is just not fit for purpose. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Martin Bignell. I'm the Scotland and North of England rep for the Rail Freight Group. We're a trade association with about 120 members. Those members stretch from freight operating companies who people generally associate with being the rail freight industry, but it's much wider than that. Our membership include logistics companies that are active in rail, terminal operators, end customers, people manufacturing and repairing and maintaining wagons, and all of the other sorts of activities that are related to rail freight. So our perspective is quite broad. I include in that ports as well. Ports are a major contributor to traffic on the railways. I mean, the interesting thing, I think, from us, from a regional perspective, is there's an awful lot of traffic that could come through the ports onto rail in this region, but by and large, it goes back out of the region to other locations. The volumes that come through, I think, we've already heard, are pretty substantial and could certainly grow substantially more. And I think you have to kind of look north and south in that regard, and just throw a quick statistic in there. About 70%, just under, of all the traffic imported into Scotland actually comes out the north of England across the northwest, Yorkshire, Humberside and Teesside. So there's an awful lot of volume coming into the country through this part of the world. Our objective is obviously to help grow rail freight, doing that by working with our members and giving them opportunities to network and grease the wheels of commerce, as it were, to lobby government for improvements which we're actively doing, and to promote rail freight generally, doing things like this, I would say. So yes, it should be a good debate. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Zoe McLernon, Head of Policy and Advocacy in the Great British Railways Transition Team, GBRTT. Just to give a bit of background, if you haven't heard of GBRTT before, we are the body set up following the Williams-Shapps review, looking into rail reform. We are in a bit of a stop-start situation at the moment in terms of next steps for rail reform, but what we do have is a really strong strategic freight unit within that, looking at the opportunities for rail freight across the UK and beyond. I think if I boil this question down, how do we transform the North to become a global gateway? There are three things that come to mind, and that is joined up thinking. Now, everyone says that. It's a buzzword, isn't it? It's a buzzword. But we are already trying to work towards that within the rail networks. We've recently, in the last 2 weeks, joined up freight teams from across the rail network so that we can have a more aligned approach when it comes to rail freight and its growth. And when I talk about growth, just before Christmas, the government announced the 75% rail freight growth target, which has been something we've been working on for a very long time. It's not a ceiling. Some people were a bit concerned that it wasn't as aspirational as hoped, but actually, it's there, it's government backed, and it's the first long-term rail freight growth target of its kind. So it's a really good thing to get behind. But how do we achieve that growth? And that is a fundamental question. I think it starts with advocating for freight and for moving goods and showing people exactly what freight does and what freight moves. When you can get into the hearts and minds of local people who didn't know their toilet roll travels by rail every day, actually you're going to make huge steps to supporting growth in that sector and therefore supporting the economies in this region as well. So I'm sure there'll be a few more discussions on those points as we go forward, but that's everything from me for now.
Thank you, everybody. I am going to come to the audience for questions, so please do get your thinking caps on and be ready to put your hands up in a couple of minutes. But just before we do that, I have actually got a question for the panel. One of the things which we haven't really touched on in our intros there is the need to reduce emissions from the sector and to encourage modal shift. Are we doing enough at the minute to get freight from the road to rail in the north, and what more can we do? So Zoe, you mentioned about your ambitious target. If I could maybe start with you on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth pointing out we'll always need road. We'll always need all modes of transport to have a successful logistics supply chain ultimately. Rail does produce around 76% less CO2 per ton kilometre than road, and it can transport up to about 125 lorries worth of goods in one freight train. So it's got a phenomenal opportunity, and that is growing every single day. I think when it comes to decarbonising and that modal shift point, we need to recognise that, you know, that last mile will always need road. But making sure we're filling up trains, I think, ultimately at ports and other centres to make sure all of the trains are as full as they possibly can be is key, and encouraging people to use rail, and addressing some of those myths and the barriers that they've got to entry. So cost can often be quite a significant issue. How can we look at that, and how can we deal with that factor? We've just responded at GBRTT and Network Rail to the Mode Shift Revenue Support Scheme call for evidence, and we've encouraged government DfT to look at new opportunities and think a little bit outside the box when it comes to incentivising rail.
Thanks. Now, it's an interesting question, actually. What can we do to encourage more freight on rail, I think was the question. And I suppose the thing that springs to my mind is, who do we mean by we? And I think that the fact we're in this forum organised by Transport for the North suggests to me the we in this context is the public sector. And the reason I say that is the one absolutely fundamental difference between passenger railway and freight railway is the freight railway is entirely commercial. In that way, I think it's actually a lot simpler than the passenger railway. We heard this morning the enormous amount of frustration that came from trying to coordinate all of these elements of the network operators rolling stock to come up with answers. In our world, our members, in terms of the freight operating companies, have their own balance sheet. They're independent commercial competing companies. They'll run traffic when it's commercially viable for them to do so. So the question then becomes, well, how do you configure or engineer or structure the network and the capacity on the network for those operators to then run those services commercially efficiently? And that comes from providing a network that has sufficient gauge, so you can run intermodal containers through without using obscure and specialist wagons. That's if they can go through at all. It means finding paths on the network which they can use viably to get turns of the asset within a 24-hour period. And that might mean having to run through some fairly congested networks at times of day when maybe the passenger operators and the general public perhaps wouldn't prefer them to run. Alternatives to that is obviously looking at opportunities to find diversionary routes that mean that doesn't have to happen, but that means investing in the network and network capability. Point-to-point journey times, and I mean by that average speed from end to end, really important. We do get a bit hung up on absolute maximum speed, but in our sector, what we need is consistency, predictability, reliability, and if the rail industry can offer that on a 24/6 basis, the market, their customers, who are also commercial, will look much more favourably on switching to rail as an alternative, because it has that dependability they can use. And as Zoe said, there's an enormous amount of environmental advantages to switching, but the product has to be right, and has to be right both commercially and operationally, because the supply chains aren't just the rail bit or the road bit. By and large, they tend to be much longer than that. So you're plugging into networks which have an awful lot of other costs attached to them, whether that's in stock holding or warehousing or manufacturing facilities or whatever it might be. So in terms of are we doing enough, I think it's very much incumbent on seeing freight in that perspective. It's national, it's commercial. Freight operators are quite happy to run trains. They want to run trains. They want to run electric trains. But actually, we have to create the environment and the conditions that allows them to do that in a commercially viable way. Otherwise, I'm afraid, there really isn't a lot of incentive for their customers to start to switch, and that's ultimately who you're trying to attract.
Councillor Handley, I'll come to you on that one as well.
Absolutely. Actually, I've just listened to what you said, Martin, and I can't really add much more to that. You said exactly as it is, because it always comes down to pounds, shillings and pence at the end of the day. And we all want reduced carbon emissions. All of us want that. There's nobody that doesn't want that, and that's what we're all working towards. But as you quite rightly said, it comes down to the commercial activity, the commercial operators, and until we can fix that, we are going to be in this conundrum for a while to come.
Chris.
So if you run an international airport, then sustainability is always a soapbox you're happy to jump on. I think from my perspective, in terms of getting the cargo into the UK, into Manchester Airport, in the most sustainable way possible, so that can be distributed sustainably from there. The big opportunity we have ahead of us is sustainable aviation fuels, and over in Birkenhead there's a site that we could be already building on that would provide Manchester Airport with 10% of its total fuel for aircraft and deliver a 70% reduction in the amount of carbon associated, and in fact use the black bin bag waste of Greater Manchester or indeed Liverpool to power that plant. The government had talked about having 5 plants under construction by the end of 2025 and 10% of all jet fuel be sustainable by 2030. Both of those targets look some considerable distance away as I sit here now. So again, if anyone wants to join me on that bandwagon, then I'd be keen to welcome you.
Thank you. Happy to take questions from the audience now. Very quick. Over to you, sir. We do have a roving mic. If I could just get it to this gentleman in the front, please.
Hi. Oh, is that? Yeah, perfect. Nice one. Hi all, my name's Jude. I'm from Sheffield in South Yorkshire. I think I'm really glad you two both made those points there, because my question is sort of related. So it's more specific to airports, so Chris, but also more widely it is sort of about sustainability and commercial transport. So I'm from Sheffield. DSA closed. I'm very upset about it. I'm also an environmentalist. I work for a community transport company that wants to take cars off the road. I work for a company that its prime target is carbon reduction. But I'm so sad that DSA is closed, because I don't think you can have a functioning city region or command authority without a global hub, without a global gateway for both passengers and businesses to come through. We need South Yorkshire to be thriving. In a lot of other cases, Heathrow expansion, for example, obviously expanding it is quote unquote good for the UK because it keeps us as a interchange hub. But I think it's a lot more blurred. I don't think it's blurred at all about having DSA, but that's hard for me to say. I feel almost like I'm battling with myself. So my question to you guys is, how do you manage that? How do you manage that sort of that dilemma between sustainability and genuinely trying to economically level up the north? It's very hard, because a lot of expansions go ahead easily in the south because business cases are seem to be highly regarded there, whereas we are sort of penned into this box of, well, we need to be sustainable, but that's because we've been given less historical opportunity to advance ourselves commercially. So yeah, that's my question. How do you balance that?
I think from Manchester Airport's perspective, we think about getting to the airport. if Northern Powerhouse Rail gets built, then 50% more people can get to the airport on an hour and a half train journey than today. So really clearly, if I'm chasing down sustainable aviation fuels to put in the planes, and we've got a decent Northern Powerhouse Rail equivalent rail project underway that actually makes it much more straightforward to get to the airport by train. You know, getting to Sheffield from Manchester Airport is but it's still a bit of a mission. And you know, today coming here, you know, Liverpool to Manchester, I drove because it would have taken me an extra half an hour on the train, and I'd have passed hamlets and stopped, in fact, in hamlets along the way that I didn't even know existed. And I was born in Widnes and lived there for 20 years. So, you know, the you know, kind of, I'm sure we're preaching to converted in the room that says there's a lot of work to do on the rail network, and that's a big part of driving the sustainability agenda, because you can turn the electricity green, power the trains with green electricity, and then you're well on your way.
Thank you. And Jude, that's a really interesting question that you've just asked, and I think it actually takes us sort of onto a much bigger topic about appraisal of schemes and how you think about appraisal of schemes in the north, and making sure that it's not just about the economics, it's more about the environmental, and it's about the benefits to society. And really happy to have a conversation outside of this, because that's something that we're really interested in at Transport for the North. Martin.
Yeah, just picking up on that. I mean, what I found quite interesting about the session this morning was there seemed to be some unanimity, if that's the right word, on the panel about sort of go big or go home. And I think that really applies up here. Over many, many years, you could argue that investment in the north has been, watered down. I was going to say that's probably the wrong phrase, but you know, you've suffered a long period of some industrial decline, and inevitably there's some rationalisation that happens on the back of that. But you're now in a point where networks have been thinned out over a long period of time, and it's very difficult to build them back up again. But building the business case to do that is incredibly difficult, because it's inevitably going to be horrifically expensive. And I think that was, as I say, what was really encouraging. There seemed to be a recognition that actually you kind of need to stick your hand in the pocket if you're really serious about building up the region, because you're building 100-year infrastructure ultimately, certainly in the case of railways. Once you've created a tunnel, I mean, crikey, we're using a Victorian network today, and I don't suppose the Victorians were looking at the business case over, I don't know what they did in the 1800s, but over a cup of tea going, well, are we going to get benefits in 2023 type of thing? And I think that it's that really long-term vision which is important, and it's always just the way that the business cases are calculated at the moment. You know, if it's purely financial, you know, inevitably investments are going to head further south where you do get a bigger return. So I don't quite know how you square that, other than perhaps being bold, taking a few risks perhaps, and doing some projects that are a bit riskier, a bit more expensive, and you're not quite sure of the outcome. Dare I say it, take a more commercial perspective on these things and be 80% confident rather than 100% confident. Because that might sort of pump primer an outcome that's unexpected. So it's a tough one, though.
Councillor Handley.
Hi, Jill. Great question. And actually, DSA, I'm just as upset as you are about that. It's 15 minutes from my door to getting on an aeroplane, and now it's gone.
This is such a wide region, you know. It was the airport that I used, and I'm on the west side of Sheffield. Yeah. But then you've also got so much East Riding that we use it as well. Yeah.
So I feel your pain on a regular basis when I have to get in the car and drive an hour and a half to get on a plane. So I'm with you. I don't know what the answer is, to be fair. I don't think anybody can really find one at the moment. I think you would struggle. I do have to say, though, if we did open up the airport, it would be less emissions, because there'd be a lot less people travelling a long, long way to get to places. And it is a commercial, and I am on the Facebook page for Doncaster Airport. I'm there. I want it. Why haven't we got it? So I'm absolutely with you. But I honestly, I just don't know what the answer is, because there's the money, There's a CO2, there's a money, there's a which way do you go? And that is, at the end of the day, it is down to the commercial operators, isn't it? But hopefully, Jude, we are going to get our airport back. Absolutely. Yes. Next time it's Transport for the North, we can announce it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah, hi everyone. Jonathan Walker. I'm from Logistics UK, with a trade association that represents the logistics industry. We've heard a lot this morning, and you hear a lot at these conferences about public transport, about buses, about trains, about moving people around, and that's understandable. It's what we all see. And then we get the great work like Transport for North and others do around writing their freight and logistics strategies. But what we don't often see, certainly at a national level, is how do you tie those two things together so that actually all transport strategy and all transport policy is freight and logistics policy? Because actually, the work I do a lot of work on infrastructure, and actually we keep making the case that, you get more people into buses and out of their cars or into trains. That frees up space. That makes freight and logistics more efficient, less harmful to the environment, be it CO2 or clean air. How do we sell that to, I guess, particularly politicians who are ultimately accountable to the public, who don't see freight and logistics until their shelves are empty? How do we make that case? And HS2 is a classic case in point. Actually, I think it was sold very much to the freight and logistics industry as opening up huge potential, but it feels like that's been forgotten in the sort of noise after the decision.
Brilliant question. Good one for Zoe to start with, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. A brilliant question. And I'll touch on something I mentioned in my first couple of minutes. It is that advocacy piece, talking to people. So as soon as we got the growth target, we were out talking to MPs, talking to SDBs, mayoral combined authorities, about what freight facilities they have in their areas and really educating them on that. Now, that's one piece, and that's, it sounds quite fluffy, and that's great, but we've also got to be a bit more innovative when it comes to using passenger transport. So parcels as passenger on trains, could we do that? And that is something we're exploring at the moment. The express freight market has a huge opportunity to support that integration. And not only do we need to utilise passenger vehicles to move freight and logistics, we also need to think about stations, and I'm not a passenger expert, so forgive me on this, but stations need to be a bit of a hub as well for those things. So if we are going to move parcels, particularly high-value goods in the medical sector, which would be, perfect for that kind of industry and those kinds of movements, how do we then move them on from those stations? And how can people, your everyday person, use those? And then we also need to look at the planning system. There's been a lot of discussion about the planning system, the planning framework over the last few years, making sure that every decision that's made at that planning level is considers freight and logistics in doing so. And that's easier said than done, because it is that invisible, it's the invisible sector that no one, like you say, no one appreciates until they can't get flour, eggs, chocolate, loo rolls, etc. So really, it's that education piece in local authorities as well, I think, is fundamental to have that integrated transport system and to use it in all sorts of different ways. So yeah, keep an eye out for express freight as you... although don't worry, we won't be kind of filling up your train carriage with parcels just yet.
Yes, great question. One we tackle quite often as the yourselves. I think part of it is probably, there's two things probably, partly cultural and historical. The public sector has an awful lot of degree of control, funding, specification of the passenger railway and the infrastructure, of course. So there's an awful lot of people probably in this building today very focused on how the railway works and what it delivers from a passenger point of view. And that filters down through the entire public sector, from local authorities up to Network Rail into government, I suspect. So that's one thing. I think in terms of culture, it is something we have to address. And just a very tongue-in-cheek example, if you go to the first page of Network Rail's website, what does it say? What's their strapline? Yeah, I told you earlier. Go on then. Failed. It says putting passengers first. And you kind of think, right, okay, so Network Rail, you have two customers. You have passenger customers and freight customers. So why is the front page of your website putting passengers first? that flows all the way through the culture of the organisation. So I think it's little things like that which really, you know, we have to battle with. But I think this is where perhaps things like the freight target could be really useful. I'll correct you. Actually, we had a freight target in Scotland in CP6, so yours wasn't the first. And it's, I mean, it was what it was in CP6. It's now 8.7% in CP7 with a stretch target to 10% in Scotland, which is arguably a bit more ambitious than what's going to come south of the border. But to be honest, that growth target, I think, is a little bit irrelevant as an absolute number. What in Scotland, we've observed is that it really drives behaviours. It drives alignment of incentives between Network Rail, Transport Scotland, the operators, the wider freight sector in Scotland in terms of terminal operators and customers. We're all aiming for the same thing, and all of the different decisions throughout Network Rail and the different organisations are always done through the lens of what does this mean for freight? How does it help us achieve the growth target? And that's actually the value of having the target rather than the number itself. So I think it's things like that which will really help, but it is a constant battle to keep on the agenda. And just sort of a final note, just to point out, freight I think was mentioned once this morning, so that just proves the point.
Chris, from a private sector point of view, what's your take on this? How do we join up better?
What's interesting is when airlines are looking at long haul routes, then the cargo is a really important part of their commercial mathematics, particularly. If you look at some of the winter months, you imagine it as a destination that's popular in summer, but in winter you want to have year-round flying, but in winter there are fewer passengers. It's the cargo that sits in the bellies of these aircraft, and it's interesting you talk about having passenger trains with cargo on them. It's the exact equivalent of an aircraft that uses its belly hold to carry high-value, usually cargo. We opened a route to Beijing with Hainan Airways, and the difference that made to the amount of cargo going back and forth between China and Manchester was enormous, and then encourages organisations to put their offices in Manchester and or Beijing, and so the benefits of delivering that integrated transport network, you really do see the economics come through when you connect to places. I'm absolutely convinced. I talked about 100 million GVA for Liverpool and for Leeds, and 10 for Hull earlier. I'm absolutely convinced if we improve the transport links between these places, that those numbers would be much higher, no question. And a decent chunk of that GVA would be in the cargo.
But if we get Doncaster Airport open, you never know. From a council point of view, we are actually working on an integrated transport system at the moment with Hull, and we do genuinely realise how important that is. We are actually halfway through our consultation for a mayoral combined authority. So if that comes to fruition, and it is looking very, very good that that's what will happen, then we will have, we have 1,000 square miles of rural countryside in the East Riding. It's huge. And then right in the middle, we've got a city called Hull that not many people seem to know about today, because I've only heard that word mentioned once on the stage as well as freight. So the world doesn't end at Leeds, but it appeared to be for me. So we are working on that, and it is really important. And we have got the largest area of ports in the UK, the global gateway to Europe. It is vital that we get all that right and all sorted, and that is something that we will be taking forward. So again, watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? I've got a gentleman over there. So there we go. And then I'll come to you next, sir.
John Holwell. 2 questions. One is, has the panel heard of LOFT, L-H-O-F-T, the Liverpool Humber Optimisation of Freight Transport? And if you haven't, which I suspect you haven't, would you obtain a copy, which you can obtain from the University of Hull Business School or Logistics Institute? The reason I say that is because you will find a vast amount of data about imports and exports through the Humber, Immingham and Hull and across the Pennines, rail capacity and all the rest of it, which I think is partly what we're talking about today.
Well, I'm Matthew Bentley. I'm a guard for West Midlands Trains in Birmingham.
And what about the answer to the question?
Oh, sorry.
So, Martin, you've seen it.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, tongue-in-cheek there, John. But yes, I have seen it. It's a while since I've read it, I'll be honest. But you're absolutely right. It was a great piece of work. And I was in Immingham, it must have been about a year ago now, meeting with one of the big shipping lines there, who's sadly not a member of Rail Freight Group anymore. But anyway, that's a different thing. But yeah, I mean, they were talking about it and were sort of talking through the work that they were involved with the university, and it absolutely does paint a great picture of the volumes that are coming through the port, and the traffic and the potential and some of the challenges of putting it on rail. And I suppose we can't be a bit too down on issues really, because there are some positive stories in here. Transpennine route upgrade is coming on, and that's going to be a genuinely transformational project across the Pennines. At the moment, you simply can't run intermodal freight from east to west. Once that corridor is open, there's an entirely new market there that can be exploited from east coast ports to the west, northwest, and west coast ports to the northeast and Yorkshire and Humberside. So that's really positive. We'd like it to come a lot quicker, but and that's when you can start to tap into some of these volumes that report sort of suggests.
It is something which I will have a look for back at my role. I'd be very surprised if it didn't form the basis of the Transport for the North freight and logistics strategy and part of the evidence base, but I will look into it in my new role.
Oh, yes, that's right. I think she wants to...
No, and I'll certainly look into it. That's my homework for tonight. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm Matthew Bentley, guard for West Midlands Trains. I live just outside of Birmingham. But this is partly following on from what the gentleman here has said about that study from Hull University. In order to get extra freight trains on, you're going to inevitably need more lines over time, reopened lines, frankly, which unfortunately the government seems to want to run away from. The study suggested a reopened Woodhead route, which should be there already, frankly. And you've got Peak and Dales line as well between Matlock and Buxton and Chinley, and also even more simple, Skipton to Colne. What are the panel's thoughts on at least trying to get those lines back, at least making a start on it? I know it can't happen overnight, but at least over the next 5 to 10 year period, it should be perfectly doable.
Martin, I'll maybe come to you on that one to start with.
I was hoping you wouldn't. I'm no expert on the network and the infrastructure, I have to say. But you're right. There are lots of potential opportunities for lines that have been closed but still exist in some form to be reopened. Leamside line I noticed out there today is another potential opportunity, which I'm not entirely sure the freight operating companies would be massively keen to route their trains that way if it took them a lot longer. But in terms of strategic capability as a diversionary option for the East Coast Main Line, it certainly brings some value if it has some equivalence with the East Coast route as well. And it's those sorts of things that build resilience. And from our point of view, if we're going to attract freight customers to the railway, they need to have the confidence that the network's not going to be shut, periodically, because what do they do then? I mentioned some of the difference between the passenger railway and the freight railway. Us as individuals can all make individual choices every day of what we want to do, but in aggregate, there's going to be a volume of people using rail services, passenger rail services. In the freight world, you've probably got a handful of decision makers who have command of a huge volume of traffic. And if they're not comfortable using rail, you've got none of it. And I think that's where that resilience thing and the infrastructure that provides that is really important.
Yeah, really good question. And I think we sometimes get a little bit bogged down in the large scale, the strategic rail freight interchanges, the intermodal interchanges. And actually, there's a huge number of smaller infrastructure projects that could make a huge difference. So one of the pieces that the team I work with were looking at was a piece of rail that had been completely abandoned in the very southwest of Wales. and they've managed to go forth and find someone that would, you know, happily take that on, and it's going to make a huge difference in terms of the amount of goods that could be moved by rail into that part of the world. So it's quite easy to get bogged down, I think, in the big projects, but there are definitely opportunities out there, and hopefully a strengthened kind of market development team within the centre of rail freight, however that looks, will be able to deliver on some of those. I mean, I can't make any promises as I sit here, but yeah, and aggregates as well. That kind of those areas of the country, aggregates, bulk, really fundamental. And if we can improve access and connectivity around that, then that's going to benefit the economy and those businesses at the same time.
Thank you. Just down there first. Here we go. Simon.
Simon Emery from ACOM. We've heard a lot about the commercial reality of the freight sector, and then we've heard lots of stuff about individual modes. It strikes me that data is one of the fundamental issues in freight, and actually the ability for the public sector to be able to access data to do the good strategic planning that several of you have talked about. So interested, I guess, from those individual perspectives on your thoughts as to how we get better data to inform better planning within the public sector. Otherwise, it strikes me that the public sector is really working with at least one, if not 1.5 hands tied behind its back.
Great, another great question. Councillor Handley, shall I start with you?
I wouldn't know where to start on that, to be fair.
I'll tell you what, I'll give it to Chris. Okay.
I might not answer the question, but I have thoughts. I think the fundamental difference between passenger and freight is that freight is ultimately private sector. And us going to those freight operating companies and asking for the data and the commercials is incredibly difficult. You know, they run on very small margins, very tight margins, and ultimately it's a competitive industry. So I think we as an industry need to make better use of the data that we can aggregate, anonymise and put out there. And I'm hoping that's something that will become a bit more possible, particularly with the growth target, because we are going to have to consider how we deliver on it. So that's not an answer, but I think, yeah, if we can pull together some data as an industry, I think that would be an answer to that question in the long run, but harder than it looks.
Chris, if I could maybe ask you as well, obviously with your private sector hat on, how do we start to access data better?
I think it is true that access to passenger data is easier and higher quality than freight, and that's true of airports as much as it is rail. You know, I could tell you the number of passengers that flew every route in 2022 because the CAA collect it all and then distribute it, but we don't. It's much more difficult to figure out what's gone in the belly of our the aircraft that take off and land. Part of the challenge is you need the people to want to build the business cases who have the data themselves. You know, it is a commercial business, and therefore, actually, you don't need the public to build a business case in quite the same way. Actually, it's in my case, the airline that does its analysis that says how much cargo do I think I could put in the belly of this aircraft, and therefore how much money am I going to make out of cargo on top of the passengers. And I guess the challenge with rail is that because the volumes are so much larger, you can't make that decision on an aircraft by aircraft basis in quite the same way when it's a train. And so some mechanism by which you can actually aggregate it in a way that anonymizes it would be incredibly useful, but somebody has to pick that baton up and run with it rather than stand on the sidelines and be sorry it's not there. Eventually someone's got to, you know, from an organisation that aggregates the partners involved and actually get people to sign up and make the case that the data is valuable to those people who submit it as much as it is to the people who get to read it.
Can I offer a controversial viewpoint on this? I think we get a little bit obsessed with data You're absolutely right. Commercial freight data is incredibly difficult to get hold of for all the reasons said. It's private data. What operator is going to share their data for no value, to themselves at least? But I think this is where it ties into the business case argument, which is where it's useful. And I suppose using TransPennine again is a really good example. No doubt an awful lot of work was done to work out whether there was any traffic to go on the revised TransPennine route. If we created gauge, is there anything going to move on there? I would challenge you to spend 20 minutes stood on the M62 and work that out for yourself. You know, there is an element of, you know, especially on the strategic corridors, you know, the public sector, you know, if it was truly being as visionary as maybe we were hearing this morning, it should be able to create its own outcomes. It's, you know, create its own reality in the long term. If you want something to happen, create the infrastructure that enables the market to respond in the way you want it to respond. Don't try and predict it. The one really good thing about freight is it's like lightning or water. It will find the easiest and the most cost-efficient way of moving from one place to another. So if you create a huge, great pipe, it will probably flow through it. You don't necessarily need a huge amount of data to work that out. But when it comes to business cases, I appreciate accountants probably want that.
Thank you.
Because somebody has to pay for the pipe. Yeah. That's the challenge, and believe that they're going to make some money out of it.
I've got time for a few more questions. I'm going to go here and then to the back, and we'll see how we're getting on for time.
Hello. Hi, I'm Dr. Dimitrios Paraskevadakis. I'm a senior lecturer in maritime logistics and transport at Liverpool John Moores University, and I'm also the chairman of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport for the Merseyside and Warrington Group. So, yeah, talking about universities and the LOFT project, I remember the LOFT project. It was a nicely did project that lasted for a couple of years and stands for Liverpool Humber Optimization for Freight Transport. And basically, the LOFT project was circling around the idea of the M62, was looking into modal shift, how to decongest and shift freight off the road network, connecting Liverpool and Hull, Humber. But you should know that the LOFT project was basically built upon a movement that happened many years ago. It was a group of people very much interested on the E20 route, which the E20 route is an international route. So I'm not sure who's familiar with the designated United Nations international road system. So if you drive abroad, you will see that there are these distinctive white-green signs, basically. So the E20 is the route. If you Google it and do some homework, you will see that the E20 and the M62 is part of the E20. The E20 route is a route that starts from Limerick and goes all the way up to St. Petersburg in Russia, and that involves lots of short sea shipping. Goes through Sweden, Denmark, and involves short sea shipping routes as well, just for your information. And there have been other projects as well. So, for example, the university, we have the Logistics Freight Transport Research Institute, and we have been involved in similar projects in the past, one of them being the West Flows project, which was an EU indirect funded project. West Flows stands for West and East Freight Flows, and which built upon the development of the logistics gateway. Now, so I think we need to treat the North as a region, firstly, and not as a gateway. So the North is a mega region, basically, and the gateway, which is supported by a system of gateways. One of them being the Liverpool Gateway, you have the Hull Gateway and other gateways as well, the Manchester Airport Gateway. So the thing with gateways, if you look into the academic literature, for example, I'll give you an example. So a few years ago, I've asked my students, some of my students, to report an assignment on the Atlantic Gateway, because over the last few years, when we look into marketing and branding, the gateway has changed a lot of names. It has been known many years ago as a superport. Then it was the name was changed to the Atlantic Gateway. Then it was a few years ago where I asked my students to do a report about the Atlantic Gateway, And then a few days after, they came back to me and they said, which Atlantic Gateway? Only to discover that the Canadians, they also branded their gateway in Toronto as the Atlantic Gateway as well. Okay, so yeah, I think the North is the mega region, which is supported by a system of gateways. The thing with the gateways is that they share similar characteristics: accessibility, reliability, connectivity, multimodal transport, accessibility, such as such. So see, for example, that Belfast is a gateway, Dublin is a gateway, Rotterdam is a gateway, Antwerp is a gateway, you know, Le Havre is a gateway, the London Gateway is a gateway. So all of them having the Luxembourg is a gateway, which is a landlocked gateway, supported by the airport. But I think, so the question, coming to the question now, so in terms of branding and governance, so how should we brand the North Gateway? See the role as a UK land bridge as well, because we see now that there is a movement of direct ro-ro freight connections between the European mainland and as well. And so in terms of branding, so in the future, how should we brand the North as a gateway? And the governance as well. Who is governing? Is it transferred to the North? You know, sometimes there is confusion. Who is the... Thank you.
If I take the branding point first, my airport's called Manchester Airport, and so as a brand that then says, oh well, isn't it sort of narrowly focused on Manchester? But we talk about being proud to connect the North because, as I said right at the start, our passengers and our cargo go up into Scotland, across into Wales, across to Hull, and down as far as Birmingham. So it is, branding really is quite important, and I do think that we should be seeing the North as the North, particularly when you think long haul internationally. There are 2 gateways in the UK for long haul international routes, and they are Heathrow in London and Manchester in the north. And Heathrow is the gateway for the south of England, and Manchester is the gateway for the north.
Councillor Handley.
From my perspective, in the Humber, we are actually called the Energy Estuary. So we're known for being the energy, and that's our branding in the Humber, and that's how we promote ourselves. But I think what you're asking is, should we call ourselves something, the whole of the North, to have a branding that is just for the North? I think that's what you're asking, isn't it?
It's also known as the Northern Powerhouse.
It is, yes. So that's our part of the M62 corridor, if you like, and that's what we're known as well, because we obviously have all the wind farms and well, we've got the hydrogen. We've got we're hoping to get the out into the North Sea, the hydrogen, but what they've got over here. So we're doing the green hydrogen. We're doing the all sorts of different energy things. So that's us. That's who we are.
I'm going to take the last 2 questions together, just at the back there, and then I'll turn to the panel for their comments.
Hi, James Hanson. I'm a councillor in Sefton, which is the neighbouring authority, which is where the Port of Liverpool is. I'm also the lead member for Rail and Freight on the City Region Transport Committee. Now, the Port of Liverpool and Liverpool to expansion is incredibly important for this region. You know, economic growth, jobs. One of the things that's often forgetted is the health implications, particularly for residents who live on that corridor on the route into the port. Now, how do we balance decision making in terms of public health and economic growth? Because obviously, for example, if you look at central government's solution, it was to put a relief road through the only open green space that affects roughly 200,000 residents. So how do we balance that?
Thank you. I'll take the other question as well, and then we'll answer them both together.
Cheers. Similar but different. I'm Stu. I'm from North Liverpool. I'm a sustainable transport campaigner. I was quite happy to jump on the sustainability bandwagon. Is it frustrating, because a lot of people have talked about how east-west connectivity is really the real issue? Is it frustrating that Drax get to dominate a railway between Liverpool and Selby in Yorkshire with up to 10 trains a day, filled with biomass fuel, when that could be taking hundreds, if not thousands, of HGVs off our roads?
Thank you. Councillor Handley, can I maybe ask you about how do you balance the sort of health and societal impacts with economic growth?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, as a councillor, I am with you on that. And at Hull, we have to come through the city centre with all our freight to get it onto the M62. So I'm with you on that, and it is something that we are looking at. The ports of Hull start out, well, in the East Riding, come through Hull and then out. And we have got lots and lots of people that live on the same corridor with the same problems as what you are having. And it is something that we are looking at, and we need to. We have also got a prison there as well, actually. You pass the Hull prison as well. So there is an awful lot of CO2 emissions, etc., that we are working on with the residents to see what we can do to make that better. And if we had electrified rail into the port, none of that would be a problem, because it would be all taken away and there'd be no more congestion through our city like you have at Liverpool as well. So electrification of our railways, I think, is the way for us to go.
And then if I can maybe just ask Zoe, and Zoe, if you could cover both questions, that would be...
Cool. Yeah, I completely agree. It's a really difficult one to balance, and electrification is fundamental, but in my time working in rail, I've not seen much progress, if I'm honest, with that. And it'd be great to see more, and large-scale electrification would be more economically viable, of course, but we're seeing kind of small infill schemes, but we are where we are. We also need to think about alternative fuels for rail, and that's okay for passenger. You know, that's a bit more simple for passenger. Using battery-powered trains on incredibly heavy axle weight freight trains is a fair distance away, if I'm honest, along with alternative fuels. But alternative fuels could work. It's just the cost. And ultimately, that cost gets passed down to the business, to the consumer. And how do we bridge that gap? And do we have enough alternative fuels, ultimately, to deliver? So those are two things that I think would help with that balance. But I don't think there's a simple fix in the next kind of year or so. Unfortunately, I don't want to be too doom and gloom today, because it's still positive in the sense that we are moving forward. The second question,
Selby and Drax.
Of course. I mean, I should be careful in terms of what I say. You know, we support all operators across the network, in Network Rail, GBRTT. A point that was raised earlier by Martin about, you know, putting passengers first. I've been doing a lot of work to say, you know, actually it's customers, it's freight and passenger. Balancing operators' usage is incredibly difficult in terms of timetable planning and their access, and in terms of how much investment has been put into that as well. I think there's always that opportunity to look into that. You know, Network Rail are open to talking to more operators about opportunities to use the network. So I think, as much as I can't comment specifically on Drax, there are those people in Network Rail that could probably get to the bottom of certain issues with that. But it's definitely, yeah, one for me to take away, if that's all right.
I was just going to say, in the context of sustainable fuels, one of our asks of the government in terms of driving forward sustainable aviation fuel is to have a price stability mechanism, so as the extra cost of the sustainable aviation fuel isn't borne by the specific users of that fuel, it's borne by everyone equally. And whether you use sustainable aviation fuel or not in your specific plane is a function of where you are and its availability. And then the more of it you have, the cheaper it becomes. And in the end, you know, when you look out to 2050, our view is that you can get to a net zero aviation outcome without constraining demand, which is, you know, the final act that you would undertake. And so, you know, if you put that in the context of your rail challenge into the Port of Liverpool, at the very least they could be starting to use the fuel in the diesel vehicles that is at least green diesel. You don't fix the nitrogen oxide problems that way, but you do at least start to go after the carbon.
Hello, I actually researched Drax this morning. I live literally next door to the power station. And I thought, I just wonder what they use on their trains. So I was trying to Google to see, were they electric, what did they do? And what I did find out was, I think for each, they have them specially made in Yorkshire. And they, I think for each one, it's something like 3 or 4 HGVs they take off the road because they're built a certain way, and they pull into Drax and they drop underneath into the silos where the wood pellets go. And there's no more coal goes in at all. That's kind of a thing of the past. And the trains are huge, and there are a huge amount of them that it seems to be on a conveyor belt the whole time. So you kind of think we're not using fossil fuel at Drax anymore. We're using biomass. What I know they're using the trains, but that's trying to be better for the CO2 emissions, and it's just a difficult one again to manage, isn't it? What's right and how do you actually make that right? And actually, people should be able to use that. More people use that track, but there's an awful lot of trains going there. And we had a pellet factory that Drax set up in Goole, and they run the straw in there 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, and it kept Drax power station going for one 24-hour period, and they closed that down now, and it's mothballed and it's up for sale. So if you can, the volume that goes in there is unbelievable. And I don't know if them trains are running on there all day, every day, but there's certainly a huge amount, and they've just invested in another 30, I'm sorry to say.
I'm going to draw us to a close. I don't want to keep anyone from their coffee before the next session. That has been a brilliant discussion, and thank you to everybody for coming along today, and thank you for your questions. And if I can just ask you to thank our panel as well. Just the final word from me. I think what really comes out of today is collaboration. We need to work across the public and private sector on freight and logistics. We need to help make the case for freight in the north. We need to work collaboratively to do that. And we need to think multimodally. We need to start thinking about how we hit some of those hard challenge and rail targets that we have. So lots for us to take away today. In terms of next steps, if you can make your way to the Grey Suite, which is the main room, you've got about 15 minutes before the next panel starts. So please help yourself to a cup of tea on the way, and we will see you in there. Thank you, everybody.